Right, welcome back. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Traditionally, of course, the after-lunch session, you've had a good lunch, it's hard work, but it won't be, because we have a truly splendid speaker, Ruth Dudley Edwards, who is a woman of many parts, a very witty author of satirical novels, and I hope she'll be talking a little bit about those. But also a distinguished historian, a biographer of Victor Gollancz, amongst others, and a writer of some very fine non-fiction books, including on Irish matters, and a winner of the CWA Gold Dagger for the best non-fiction book of the year a few years ago. But also a very entertaining speaker. I'm sure you're going to have a lot of fun now. Ruth Dudley Edwards.
Lovely to be here, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you for asking me. But may I just say that no friend should say you're going to be witty, because you always let people down, the basic point. I started out as a biographer, and I realized that that has caused me at some stage in my life to start looking at myself from the position of biographer. And a lot of my looking at myself these days comes from people asking me questions about myself, which I'm at a loss to answer. And then I have to go back and think about them. Why do you write this sort of stuff? Why do you make fun of death? Why do you make fun of things? And all that. So I'm doing a quick exercise in autobiography from my new understanding of myself, from all the interesting questions people have asked me over the years. And the first thing that's necessary to understand anything I do as a crime writer is that I grew up in a pretty academic family, and I was very much the youngest. So I spent my early life at various tables, kitchen table, with my parents and my very clever older brother and my very dogmatic, even older sister, with people arguing and trying to understand what the hell they were arguing about, because I couldn't understand the words. And the running refrain of my childhood was, Ruth, go upstairs and get the etymological dictionary, which was about half my size. I could barely carry it. I didn't know what etymology was, but that was to settle arguments about words. But I also learned that academic life seemed to be very strange, because my father was always coming home to recount the greatest new row between members of the history department in University College Dublin. And the rows seemed to me to be quite extraordinary. And again, I was too young. There was a 6-year gap with my brother, 9-year gap with my sister. And there were things that I accepted as the norm. We were very advanced in green terms, that is, environmental terms. So we had 2 different waste buckets in the kitchen. One was for wet rubbish and one was for dry rubbish, way ahead of our time. And one of them was called Otway Riven, after the professor of medieval history in Trinity College Dublin. And the other one was called R.B. MacDowell, after the modern Irish professor in Trinity College Dublin. And she was, I have to say, when I came across her, the dry rubbish lady, she was extraordinarily dry. So there are good reasons for this. But, you know, trying to make sense of this as a child is odd. And then trying to understand the rules under which we lived in Ireland, which were that the Roman Catholic Church was firmly in control, and you didn't say anything bad about them outside, but you made fun of them all the time inside, as everybody did, really. And then there were the other things you didn't question outside, like a narrow view of Irish nationalism, which was an endorsement of violent nationalism and our revolution in 1916. So I grew up really scratching my head. And when I look back, and it was only today when I was trying to think about this, that I thought there is a reason why the books I most loved when I was growing up were golden age detective fiction. I mean, I was very lucky at home because there were lots and lots and lots of books. And my mother had a great taste for detective fiction. But it was detective fiction because I think I really liked the order of English life. You know, it was that thing about the golden age. There it was, everything was ordered, everything was, you knew where you were, and then somebody murdered somebody. And then in the end, they all put it together. I know this is a very old and banal insight into the golden age, but for me, what was, let us say, a very argumentative house, where they were not short of diva performances at many times of the day and night, I loved this order thing. I mean, I have a story that I treasure, that I learned later, from a friend of mine who was brought up in England. And her mother had married a really charming Irishman. Her mother was very, very English. She married this. I mean, you know how charming the Irish can be? Never rely on it, that's what I tell you. He had all the things, the bright blue eyes and the utter charm, and she fell for him completely. And they married very soon, and they went to inhabit a small and lovely house in the country. This is the 1930s. And she went around the village leaving cards about tea. Mrs. whatever her name was, you know, will be at home for tea at whatever time it was, 4 o'clock. And by the time it was 3:30, the husband had not reappeared. And he reappeared at about 25 to 4, so drunk that he fell down in the hall. Now, the hall was extremely small. Extremely small. There was room for his body. And she had a maid, but the maid was quite small, as she was quite small, and they couldn't move him. So I just loved that story because it summed up for me what happened in an English village was that everybody came, they knocked on the door, she didn't know them, this was her first introduction to them. She opened the door, she said, "How kind of you to come." They said, "How nice to be here," and they stepped over his body. And nobody ever mentioned it. So this was an interesting insight, because I have to say in Ireland what would have happened was somebody would have said, "Oh God, let's go out and get another few bottles and we'll all get like that." So anyway, I was trying to make sense of stuff, and eventually I went to university, and I was very interested in the Irish Revolution, which nobody seemed to have written much about, and I ended up doing a biography of the leader of it, 1916, which, because I was an innocent person and living in London by then, caused outrage in Ireland because it suggested that he was a human being and not actually a saint. So that started me on a path, which was, to go back to what I was saying earlier, a lot of it the fault of P.G. Wodehouse and Richard Crompton, who wrote the William Brown books. Because from both of those, and I read everything I could lay my hands on by both of them, they were both, when you think of it, they were anti-authority, they were very subversive, but they weren't revolutionaries. I didn't like revolution. I still don't like revolution. I think it's rarely thought through, and it usually makes things worse. But I like subversives who actually don't want to destroy our lives, but do, on the whole, wish to make it better. You just look, I don't know, how many of you read the William Brown stories? Just William? Ah, that's very, very satisfying, yeah. Well, William was the most wonderful anarchist, really, but he was very decent. It was a very important part, and he did go home for tea. Not out of his mind on drink either. But he was subversive of unjust authority. So if there was a really horrid teacher, the really horrible teacher came up, and he was very subversive about pretension. That was a very important thing. And Wodehouse, I was having a great rethink about Wodehouse recently with a friend of mine who's as nutty about him as I am. And we realized he was completely anti-authority all the time. You know, the portentous bishop, the ex-headmaster who's become a bishop, which was the one about the ex-terrifying headmaster who ended up getting so drunk on Mulliner Buckyuoppo that he ended up climbing up a statue in order to paint it red. And it was the same thing with everybody, all those terrible aunts. It was all subversive. In the end, the good guys always won. They were petrified, but in the end, by cleverness, they got there. But you just think about it. Every institution he went for, communism and fascism. Do you remember his renditions of communism? I mean, he was wonderful. It was one of the Smith books. When Smith decides he's a communist, for reasons I've forgotten now, but they were good at the time. And the most hilarious descriptions of communist meetings in the 1930s. And the same thing with fascists. Do you remember Roderick Spode, who was running a fascist movement, the Brown Shorts? Yeah, and I it was this. But yet all of it was incredibly good-humoured. And it was all sane. And I always felt one of the great things with him and with Richmond Crompton was that they actually understood your average person better than the intelligentsia ever did. Because your average person was capable of seeing that the communists were pretty grim and the fascists were pretty grim, and both lots of them were pretty bad. Whereas what was happening with the intelligentsia was they were going for one or the other, because they couldn't cope with the notion that both were bad. So I had developed a dim view of academics early on. And I then went, when I went to live in England, because I wanted to get away from Catholicism and revolution, really. And the first big book I did there, I did the Victor Gollancz book. Now, Victor Gollancz was the most wonderful, gifted publisher. Brilliant man. Extraordinarily silly as well. It's when the whole thing about clever, silly people really struck home with me. How extraordinarily silly clever people can be. And I mean, we see it all around us. When you realise that's the key to much of the elite and much of academia and much of... Yeah, it's the way of it. That's why something like Brexit comes as a total surprise to them. Excuse me, you're running focus groups and polls and all the rest of it on the country, and you didn't see it coming? Why? Because I'm clever silly, actually. So Gollancz was fascinating, because I had to learn all about the 1920s and 30s and left-wing world. He was very, very left-wing. He was a communist fellow traveller. And in his orbit were all these extraordinarily intelligent people. And they got everything wrong. Just got it all wrong. I mean, he's not publishing, which he got right, but... So I spent about 4 years with Victor. I came to understand a lot. And then I moved on to writing the history of The Economist. The Economist, well, I called it The Pursuit of Reason, because that summed up The Economist. I was writing it for its 150th birthday. And by then, The Economist had spent his life trying to persuade everybody to be reasonable. And it's still trying to do this. And actually, you can't persuade everybody to be reasonable, especially not in their terms of what reason is, because they don't, again, really quite understand bad people. I love the English dearly, my adopted country, but you're plagued with a need to believe that everybody will be reasonable if only you put the question correctly to them. And it really isn't true. And also this thing of the truth lies in the middle. No, it often bloody doesn't lie in the middle. Actually, sometimes it's there. Or there. So that was something I was learning from The Economist. I mean, who were going through the throes in the late 30s of the same old thing the Times was doing. Herr Hitler is showing encouraging signs of statesmanship. No, he wasn't. So I was writing this sort of serious stuff, and along with that, I'd had the good fortune to be asked to do a crime novel, because I still loved crime fiction. And I needed light relief from what I was doing in the day job. And you could get very weary of reading tens of thousands of letters from left-wingers to other left-wingers in the 1930s talking about utopia. And even more weary reading 150 years of The Economist, excellent in many ways, though it is. So doing the odd crime novel was wonderful. And the person who brought me into doing crime fiction was my first husband, who was by then parting company from his second wife. And I was very supportive to him at that time, and he ended up saying, I know how to say thank you. You must write a crime novel for me, because I've got a list with, I've forgotten which publisher it was at the time. And I said, don't be silly, Patrick, which is what I said a lot of the time, which is possibly why we got a divorce in the first place. But he said, just do me a half-page synopsis, and I'll send you 250 quid. Well, this was 1979, and 250 quid, when you've become a freelance writer, was substantial, actually. So I also have a conscience. So although he did this, he was very beneficent to various friends, and they didn't bother to write the book, for which they got the advance, but I did. And I wrote it about the civil service job I'd left a couple of years earlier. That's the thing, I did 4 years in the civil service as well, and I learned a lot about clever silly again there. Especially politicians, it must be said. So I wrote it about that, and it came very easily. And it was, apart from blasted Andrew Taylor, who beat me for the debut dagger, wretch. No, I mean, it did okay, to my surprise. But I realized that jokes had crept into it. I didn't mean it to be a funny book. And I did wonder why on page 4 I'd murdered somebody with a statue which I think was called Peace. I thought it was strange. And things like that used to creep in. And the same, even more so with my second book, which was about another job I'd had in the post office, which was awful. And then I wrote one about the school, an English school, because by then I was married to somebody who was working in an English school. So I'd learned lots about how they feel about foreigners. So it was a more fun book, really. And then political correctness began to come on my horizon because the young editor who'd been given to me as a copy editor was read the typescript and took out of it. Now this is about 1980, when would this have been? 1989. She took out of it every word she thought was offensive about foreigners. So, you've got these teachers who despise the people they're teaching, and she removes all of them. So, I do remember being very patient in the letter I wrote her, but I remember it costing me something to be so patient. But it started getting I started getting pretty fed up on the whole political correctness front. And really, since then, my crime fiction, to an extent, it's been making fun of institutions, making fun of academia a lot, making fun of portentous people, making fun of the intelligentsia, always, and also attacking political correctness wherever I find it, because I find it an inhibitor of free speech. And it's very alarming, actually, considering the state we're in at the moment, that 20 years on from the first one I wrote entirely directed at that, we seem to be retreating rather than advancing on free speech. So I did one in early 90s, which is about murder in the Cambridge College matricide at St. Martha's. And it's actually, the murders are all about political correctness, because the college has been left a lot of money. And, there's the crowd who want to have a centre for gender and ethnic studies. They were ahead of their time. And there's the older dons who just wanted, rigorous scholarship. And then they're the ones who want a sybaritic existence. So anyway, that was a bit of fun, actually. I did enjoy writing that one. And then it became a central theme. I mean, because the erosion of our ability to say what we want to say began to strike me as very, very serious. In that, when I was growing up in Ireland, there was a particular kind of censorship and self-censorship. You didn't upset the clergy in public. You didn't upset revolutionaries. But at least between yourselves, you could be more honest. And I found there was just this whole new hierarchy of what you couldn't say. I don't like the words, "you can't say that." I really don't like those words, particularly in conversations which are supposed to be free thinking and exchanging views. So I got back to that on an Indiana campus, actually, called Murdering Americans about 10 years later, when we had all sorts of new introductions to things you couldn't say, which were about Islamists, for instance. Because by this stage, we had the BBC doing The Truth Lies Somewhere in the Middle between lunatic Islamists and anybody who was seen to be a little bit overcritical. So that was the next one. And now the one I'm writing is called Death of a Snowflake. And it's all worse. And this time, I'm not at all sure I'm going to get through this book, because in some ways it's defeating me. Because, I've been saying for 15, 20 years, pity the poor satirist. But it's beyond pity now. I don't know what to do as a satirist, to tell you the truth. I have a pile of stuff. I read the papers every day. I collect more lunacies. I go back to the book and I think, but I couldn't have thought of that. The last one I did, actually, the last one I published was about conceptual art, which I violently despise. At a stage when the whole art market really had gone over to conceptual art, Sir Nicholas Sirota, who was the kingpin of the London art museums, had, I think, utterly corrupted a generation. You had all these kids who were taught nothing at art school except how to frame a concept, but they didn't actually have any skills of any kind at all. So I had a good old go at them, and I discovered, this is a useful tip, by the way, for anybody thinking of writing a satirical novel. I got a little worried about the libel prospects and what I was, if I had a figure like Sir Nicholas Sirota, and a lawyer friend said, no, just have your characters be very rude about him, Sir Nicholas Sirota. There's nothing he can do then, it's just opinion. So my characters have learned to be extremely rude about real people. And they're advancing on that front in the new one, in Death of a Snowflake, I can tell you. They are. But I suppose what I'm trying to say is that I realize my life has been spent really, in many ways, learning from the serious, the non-fiction stuff I've done, to make fun of what I learn from it that I think is pernicious. And getting the laughs. And I don't like ideologues. As I've mentioned, I'm not terribly impressed with clever, silly people. My inspiration in the Golden Age was always Edmund Crispin and Michael Innes, who were making wonderful fun of academics and others. But it was always, again, the Woodhouse thing, the William Brown thing. You see somebody, they are important, and then you realize they're idiots. And you're going to get them somewhere or another. And it's a very necessary stage of making society better, it seems to me. So that's where I'm at. Yes, the other thing I wanted to mention, and then I'd be very pleased if you had some questions, is the other thing is I have quite an easygoing temperament, and I almost never, ever, ever lose my temper, and an awful lot of this is because of the therapy of writing crime novels. Because I've written quite a lot about other non-fiction stuff, and that can be very wearing on one's emotions and so on, especially if it's contemporary stuff, and I write a lot about terrorism. I do a lot of journalism on terrorism. But it's wonderful to have this therapy of getting back at it. For instance, dealing with Irish terrorism, there was a stage when what you couldn't say was to say anything rude about the IRA because it might discourage them from making peace. Well, I had no time for that. You just tell the truth. It's the only thing you can just tell the truth. So I discovered in the mid-90s that I was now an enemy of peace. So all these people who were mass murderers were going around saying, I think it's terrible what's been said there, trying to stir up distrust. People like that shouldn't be allowed to write. A journalist friend of mine in Belfast, at one stage, having been also labelled as anti-peace, wrote an article which ended with the line, which I'm very fond of, which, just because I've never murdered anyone doesn't mean I'm a bad person. Well, I mean, that's the stage we got to. So I endured many conferences and much of this sort of guff and diplomats ticking me off, English and Irish, for being unhelpful to the peace process. So I wrote The Anglo-Irish Murders. And it's the only one I wrote that was about Ireland, and it was very pleasing, actually. Very, very, very pleasing, and I killed a lot of paramilitaries in it. And diplomats did not come away unscathed. But the other favourite one, which is the other thing I do, which is to get out of my system a great antipathy towards a particular individual. It doesn't happen that often, but just sometimes you meet somebody who's a bad person or really doesn't deserve any quarter. And so to give you an idea, there was a woman called Dame Ruth King, who was married to the newspaper publisher Cecil King, and she had founded the National Children's Orchestra. And she was small and winsome and very spiritual, as she told one all the time. And she asked me to write the biography of her husband, which was about Fleet Street. It was an interesting book to do. I was glad I did it. But at that stage, she thought, I realized she was an utter control freak. Dreadful person, I realized quite early on. She thought I had a white soul, a white aura, until it turned black. And it turned black because I wouldn't write what she wanted me to write, and I had taken care in the contract to ensure that she had no control over it. So she blocked me from reading the papers she had sworn to let me read for years. But then she died, and I thought, well, I'm publishing the book about her brother, and her husband, and I was able to be entirely clear about her in the book. but I thought there's more to settle than this. So I made her a major character in Carnage on the Committee, which is really about the Booker Prize. and I really enjoyed it. It was so wonderful. Everything that ever irritated me about her, and there was plenty, all the faux spiritualism, all the rest of it, was there. And her death was very, very pleasing. I have to say, and quite what she deserved. So I think what I'm saying is that it can be a very useful way of bringing down to size people you think should be brought down to size. I do think that crime fiction, because it reaches the parts that so much other fiction doesn't reach, is tremendously valuable. I am so grateful to all the anarchists of my youth, like Woodhouse and Richard McCrompton and Crispin and Innes and the rest of them. And I try to keep that flag flying. So that's where I'm at now. If you have any questions, please go ahead.
Where did the Baroness come from?
The Baroness, yes, the Baroness. I did the first four crime novels. The central character was somebody from the civil service, because I was not long out of the civil service at that stage. And he was a useful character because he had access to all sorts of people, and he was a nice bloke. Possibly too reasonable, possibly too much thinking the truth lay in the middle sometimes. And on the fifth book, I started it, because I don't plan them in advance. I decide which institution I'm attacking in this book. I've done the Lords, I've done the Church of England, I've done publishers, I've done academia. So I decide on the institution, and then I decide who on the corpse, and then I see what happens. So I decided, I knew what the corpse was going to be, and I had to have a reason for sending him to Cambridge. So I invented this person who had asked him to do it, and she turned up on page 1, and I intended her to be a minor character. Her name was Jack Troutbeck, and she just rammed him in the gut and took over the book. I mean, she just did, and he became her sidekick. I mean, he put up with it very well. He's been very good about it already. And I mean, one of the things he can do as a sidekick, as sidekicks often do, which is to say, is to challenge her and make fun of her and the rest of it. And she's pretty okay about that sort of thing, but she's the driving force. And she says all the things we can't say. And a lot of the people who like these books say to me, oh, I love her. She says all the things I want to say to people all the time, and I can't say, because she's very insensitive. It's a very important part of Jack Troutbeck, extremely insensitive. So she came in on page 1, and she had proved her worth by page 2, when she set about really anarchy. And she has, and I gave her a peerage. So she did a good work in the House of Lords. And then I gave her a visiting professorship in Indiana. And then I had her kidnapped during the conceptual art book. And you can be sure she's taking a pretty strong line on political correctness at the moment. So she's well in business. And my only regret about her was that, not having realized that she was going to become the absolute linchpin of the books, I made her a little bit older than she should have been, but what the hell? I can change the rules when I like. So that's where she came from, my diseased imagination.
Ruth, how do your subversive novels go down with that very intellectual and clever family you grew up with?
Well, the first one that my mother loved crime fiction. She was delighted with it, yeah. My father didn't read crime fiction, but he dutifully, because he was a loving father, he read the first one. But he was trying to play the game according to crime novels, because he'd read about what people did in crime novels. So he kept assuring my mother that actually the real murderer was my central character, Robert Amos. And she kept saying, no, Robin, it isn't. It's perfectly clear from the book. No, I think you'll find that she has a very, clever silly. You know? But he was very supportive. My brother is very supportive. My brother and I agree on nothing about politics. He's extremely left-wing. He's he's got. I mean, we don't agree on anything. He's a Scots nat. He's all sorts of things. But we're very similar. We both love Woodhouse, and we both love crime fiction. So he's always enjoyed them. He just decides not to look at them from the perspective of opinions. You know, he accepts Jack Troutbeck as somebody whose opinions he will find appalling, but he thinks she's a laugh. So that's okay. Contributes to family harmony, has to be said. And he's an academic as well.
I was just going to say, on view of all the things the institutions you attack, and more power to your elbow, may I say, I'm really looking forward to your contribution to the death of a foreign secretary.
Oh, she's looking forward to my contribution to looking at the death of a foreign secretary. I think she was too polite to say what she wanted to say, but I think we know what she wanted to say. I don't know, Boris is a bit too much like Jack Troutbeck, actually. I think she might approve of him. I'm sorry about that. Yeah, you know. No other seminal questions?
One of the other characters I really like is the cat, because it's so much the opposite of the usual cat in crime fiction.
I go to Indiana every year for a particular crime festival I'm very fond of, and they get me to come every year because I'm the organiser's pimp in London. I introduce her to people, and she persuades them to go to Indiana, which not a lot of them necessarily want to do. But she's very, very charming, and she persuades me to go every year as well. And so I'm well aware of Americans and cats, and all the books in the book room that have pictures of cats and all the rest of it. So why did I put a cat in early on? I was trying to add some difficult character to something, and I put in the cat. And for some reason at the end, a moment of badness really, I palmed him off on my central character. I lumbered him with this dreadful cat, this atrocious cat, this furious, huge lump of marmalade cat that screamed out all the time and clawed and was utterly out of control. And I was quite interested to see how he'd get on with it. And then that cat has gone on from book to book. This is the thing, you put something in as a bit of a joke, and then you're lumbered with it. And I nearly killed it 2 books later. But then I thought, well, I don't know, I quite like Plutarch, is her name. She's so ill-natured, but she is a bit of a laugh. And she did resolve a plot point once. She can be useful. And she's quite useful to stroll in from time to time, having eaten a lot of little birds and, you know, behaving atrociously. And once, as publishers don't worry about reading the books really, a lot of them. So there was this large print book version of one of my books that arrived, and on the front of it was this lovely little white kitten. You know, I think they should have been got under the Trades Descriptions Act. I mean, I kind of prided myself with Plutarch being vile beyond belief. And then I used to find very helpful readers would say, what's she going to do in the next book? And I'd say, I think I might give her just a walk on part because I can't think of anything else. And, you know, with this person saying to me, she could pee in the piano. I think she did, actually. The following book, I can't remember. But it's nice having very disruptive influence. But I don't expect anybody to like her. And Amos has acquired a wife who loathes this cat with a passion. But Jack Troutbeck rather likes the cat because the cat mixes things up. If you have to think about Jack Troutbeck as being a bit more like Trump. Yeah. The disruptive influence is always handy in the book. Anybody else?
Well, I know there'll be hundreds afterwards. People will run at you with lots of questions. It always happens. For every one question on the microphone, there's always 5 waiting to ask afterwards. So before we welcome Michael to the stage with an introduction by Martin, please let's thank Ruth.